I do believe the Lord Jesus came to attend my talk because my glass of water mysteriously turned into wine. So good afternoon or good evening, and thank you for inviting me to speak to you at this conference. I have to confess that when Scott contacted me first, I almost said no, because I was on my way to give the keynote address at the Historical Society of Alberta. And I was also starting to write my essay paper for the Freaksell Award session in honor of my professor, David Meltzer. I felt really tempted to say no. Then I thought about it and I consulted with my husband, Tom, and I said, you know, I owe Montana an update on our research. I haven't been here with the society, I don't know how long, probably over a decade. And so much has been done in the Blackfoot Indian Reservation and vicinity that I figure I should be here. And it was a pleasure to spend my 64th birthday with you yesterday. It was a lot of fun. I had so much fun this morning. The night before, I was a little tired because the night before I was assaulted by a group of young men who wanted to talk to me about Egypt and Atlantis. And we spent 4 hours talking about it until I said, you know, I have to confess something. I really do not know. So invariably, I forget to click the thank you slide at the end of the talk. You cannot spend so many years working in a place without having multiple collaborators and a huge amount of money. And so here are my collaborators. I know I have missed a few, and my sponsors, our sponsors. Also, this is the right moment to introduce my co-author and my colleague of 13 years, Francois Lanoë. He is an assistant professor at the University of Arizona, and he had been working with me in the Blackfoot Indian Reservation in addition to his own research program in Alaska. And I have to say, he's the architect of all things science. All I do is provide crazy ideas and write checks. So, at the outset, I must tell you that I came to Montana at the pleasure of the Blackfoot tribe. They called me, I did not call them. And through the 21 years that I have worked with them, there's tropes of concern, you know, these tropes that come in every conversation I have. These concerns about legitimacy, concerns about identity, concerns about the fact that other tribes and many white archaeologists do not believe that they have been here since time immemorial, but they are interlopers. Concerns for Aboriginal rights. And by the way, when you're in Blackfoot country, you do not say indigenous. You say Aboriginal, because Aboriginal is a legal term, whereas indigenous means nothing to them. So just an alert. And then, you know, obviously they have been revitalizing their culture tremendously since I got there. When I got there, they only have a handful of beaver bundles. Now they have dozens of them. In 2018, they actually acquired the Horn Society from the Canadians. It was a ceremony that was just larger than life. I've never seen something like that ever. And so they are also concerned with education, not only for their own, but to educate white people and other tribes as to who they are. And the answer to them is science. It is wonderful to work with the Blackfoot, but because they love science. When I took that photo, that was the first time that I had visited a bison jump. I had just come down from the mountains from the Badger to Medicine. They took me to see their bison jumps. And they said, Maria, we want you to do a scientific study of these sites because science is the only language the white man understands. I knew nothing about bison hunting. Not anymore that I knew about the Badger to Medicine in the Rocky Mountains when I first took that took that project, but I marvel at my audacity of having said yes to something that I knew nothing about. Took me 20 years to learn. And I'm still writing proposals to learn some more about it. So this was my own conundrum. Everybody has artifacts in the reservation, artifacts in their backyard, in their ranches, in their pastures, and sites. And it is routinely they will come to me to ask me, what is this? How old is this? What does this site mean? How old is this? How old is the site in my ranch? And I had to say, I don't know. I would have to get a radiocarbon date, and I will get back to you. When I got there in 2004, there were only 3 or 4 radiocarbon dates that had come from the Indian boarding school that was excavated by Tom and Alice Quijo in the 1950s. And they were late dates. Nobody knew how old the archaeology in that place was. Frankly, since the Quijos left, I don't have a record of anyone doing archaeology, not even for contract archaeology in the reservation. They might as well have been there, but there's no records. And the sites that I first worked on, the bison landscape sites, only 3 people that I know, other than me, had actually visited those sites. Walter McClintock, Clark Whistler, and H.P. Lewis. Because the Quijos never made it to the site, even though they put it in their map. So I was like a kid in a candy store. I had never tasted those candies, but I was ready to eat them all, as you can imagine. You know, I had 1.5 million acres to myself and to my students and my colleagues. And that was a gift that I never anticipated I would have. So in order to progress with time, in time, you know, we began to envision a multi-year, multidisciplinary program would be an umbrella for all the projects we imagined that we could do. And little by little, we began pushing time back. 1,000 years, 5,000 years, 12,000 years, and the surprise will come at the end. So, the Blackfoot Early Origins program, which also includes professional training of tribal members for job placement in CRM and in the industry and in the agencies, and we've been doing that since 2007. It has some principles that we abide by. And the most important principle is that it's a landscape study. I am a landscape archaeologist by training. I've been doing landscapes since I got my job in 1994. That is what I've been doing. I am the one who never finds any artifacts on the ground because you know why? I always look into the horizon. So the other thing is that we want a scientific plurality. And by that I mean that we consider indigenous science, Blackfoot science equal as white science, as Western science. And plurality is the name of the game for me. And then I also, since they wanted science, I wanted to bring all the scientific innovations possible that I could possibly afford to the reservation so that we could do like a state-of-art archaeology, anything, you know. I mean, I don't know, I have so many radiocarbon dates that I cannot begin to tell you, OSL dates, remote sensing galore, you know, but the biggest thing was that we really needed to inquire into long-term persistence, deep time persistence, and the origin and enogenesis of the Blackfoot people. And that was one of the things that were probably my greatest driver, because that was the challenge that they threw at me on that day that they brought me into their bison jump. We also want to co-create knowledge. It is harder than you think. You would think that you can do community-based participatory research. That's a joke. You know what, in a tribe that has 16,000 members, my community barely counts 50 or 100, and it is a community of practice. And this is something important for the young ones to know. The very first person that becomes your liaison will define the people you work with in that particular community from then on. and you have very little freedom to choose who you work with, especially on top-down societies like the Blackfoot. So I had the privilege of having the very first person I worked with, John Murray, to be a traditionalist, a leader, and a philosopher, and also a member of the Horn Society. So guess who are my best friends? They're all members of the Horn Society. And other than my archaeologists, the ones who I train and now work with me as professionals, those are my community of practice. Those are my communities of practice. So we co-create knowledge at that level, and we have done a few other things that you will see. So this is a list of some of the projects that we've done on the reservation. We have done many other projects in federal lands, but we have, we pretty much, this covers what we have been doing. The interactive mapping project is actually something that was created during COVID for our students to be able to work remotely, and it was actually paid for with stimulus money, believe it or not. And right now, our educational materials the Bison curriculum was very successful. My traditional science and community curriculum was completely unsuccessful because the teachers got fired before we actually even got it started. But right now, I am producing a children's book. I am not writing it because I don't have any children. I don't like children. I don't like to talk to them. But I have contracted a professional writer, a children's book writer, and to whom I can actually feed content and plot. So that's going to be my baby, beginning probably after the SAAs. So let's talk about Billy Big Spring. Billy Big Spring is a really fantastic site. It is located like about 5 miles from East Glacier Lodge, which is great because we always can go and have a fantastic cocktail after Fieldwork. It is also very close to the Marias Pass, where we have incredible records of human presence and environmental records that continue to accumulate. And it is also just west, I believe, west of the corridor that became the Ulmer Trail. So even though it's small and is situated in a very high ridge overlooking the South Fork of to Medicine, it is actually accessible, and I will show you what that access meant. These are our recent publications. There's graphs and information here that I will only gloss over. If you're interested in knowing more about what we've done with the Blackfoot, with the Early Origins program, and also specifically at Billy Big Spring, please do take a look. Some of them are really boring. Others are kind of like cutting edge and really strange. But I also want to point out the forthcoming book, Cartographic Poetry, which has Francois Lanoë and his co-authors work on historic maps of Blackfoot territory and Grand territory. So that is the South Fork of Medicine. It is interesting that I've been working in Billy Big Spring for so long because I spent 4 long and harrowing years horseback riding over those mountains. You see those mountains? That's the Badger to Medicine. I spent there with some grizzled hunters for a very long time. I nearly lost my hand in an accident there. So I have some really mixed feelings about that place, which it turned out to be perfect in the end. It took 20 years, but it turned out to be perfect. But Billy Big Springs is just to the lower left corner of that image, and that is the South Fork of Medicine looking south. So there's Billy. Billy is a very small site. It is constrained on 3 sides by tall hills and a giant bedrock outcrop. And on one side, it has a nearly vertical drop into the South Fork of Medicine. So the area, the inhabitable area, it's small. But it has a tremendous record of a paleoenvironmental record going back to 14,000 years and an archaeological record going at least 12,000 years, and that is a minimum age. As you can see, you know, you can see the area, you can see the mountains. Is the ecotone of the grassland. It's a forest grassland ecotone, and and you can see where the excavations were actually took place around the glacial kettle. So this was a really interesting place. Billy Springs is in a land that was originally owned, a very large property that was originally owned by Old Man Big Spring. And the actual spring is actually downhill from the site. And I believe that Gary Sandy actually knew the Bill Big Springs II and Billy Big Springs III. He was telling me stories about how he got to know them. Well, this is, you know, this is in their property. We had to do a lot of geomorphological research before we even got to excavate to be sure what we were looking at. And so my student, Anna Johnson, actually did all of the geomorphological reconstruction. And the reason why we call it a glacial kettle is precisely out of that reconstruction. The interesting part of the kettle is that it sits on a perched aquifer that is made of glacial till. And glacial till collects water and preserves it. And it's also on clay soil, so it's pretty darn impermeable. So once water hits that impermeable surface, it starts coming up by hydrostatic energy. So that is how the pond, after the big ice block melted, that is how the pond actually renewed its water. And in addition, of course, there was runoff water from the hills surrounding it. And it is still a viable seasonal pond. There is our resident grizzly bear who keeps his spa by the site. He takes mud baths regularly at the pond. We can hear him splash from the opposite side of the pond. So even during times of extreme aridity, the pond had water and it was a viable place. So we consider that to have been one of the many refugia, environmental ecological refugia that hunters could use since the onset of the Altithermal. So how did we start working at Billy Big Springs? So Thomas Kehoe, when he was at the Museum of the Plains Indian, he heard from Bill Big Springs that there were artifacts at the pond. And so he conducted excavations in the 1950s and 70s. And his excavations were stratigraphic. He also had a surface collection. But his ideas were great. But he was also a thinker that was ahead of his time. And his colleagues, his Plains colleagues, did not believe that this site was real. They thought that because of the location of the site, it was probably disturbed or redeposited. And so he became disheartened about Billy Big Spring. And as a result of that, he did not publish anything on the site until 2001. So 30 years passed before he actually published anything at the site. And it wasn't until there was a big fire, I believe it was the Highland Fire, I'm not sure, probably the Highland Fire in 2007, that the BIA and the Blackfoot people, John Murray, went and relocated the site and the publication. And John immediately wanted to do some science at the site. But the site was on probate because Bill Big Spring II had died. And the family was fighting over the land. So it was 10 years before we could actually get access. And I still marvel at the mystery of the BIA getting us permits to get to that site without getting shot. So we started there owing to John's brilliance, where he invented the concept of site mitigation. We were working with Steve Platt at the time at the Montana Department of Transportation. And we were excavating, like savaging the site, which had no artifacts, and it was a bore. And Steve, John, and I put our heads together, and we said, we're wasting time and resources here. We should invest on archaeology that is really worthwhile. So Steve helped us get some starting money to do the first excavation at Billy. I'm sorry. Wait a second. Let me drink my Lord Jesus wine. And then we had 2 years of mitigation, and then the time came to write the big grant. The big grant, which was a grant that we submitted to the Arctic. And the reasoning was that even though we're thousands of miles south of the Arctic, we were at the south end of the ice-free corridor. So we were connected to the Arctic and to Beringia via the ice-free corridor. That was my argument. That was our argument. Francois and I argued that. And you would not believe we got the money. Not only that, but we got 2 stimulus extra monies. 2, not just 1. I tell you, that was priceless. Convincing those people to give us money, that was priceless. So, in looking at, of course, we had to look at Quijote's excavations first, and we tried to relocate one of his trenches. That is a long story, but we could see the outline of it, but we didn't know whether we were excavating his backfield or actually a new area in the site. So we stopped trying to do that. But one of the things is that, Quijote really amassed a large collection, and both from the surface and stratigraphic. And if you see the bottom point, he didn't have any radiocarbon dates. He submitted some, but he didn't have any luck getting any dates. But he firmly believed that the point at the bottom was actually a Sibald Creek point, which is called a stubby clovis. And the moment I looked at it, I thought, oh my God, this is a stubby clovis, which turned out not to be. But again, he was the one who truly started working on this side. And then the second thing that we did before, we actually started digging holes. I'm a landscape archaeologist. I said that before, right? I cannot see a site if it's in front of me. I have to see the landscape. And so one of the things that we did is we collected a lot of archaeological and paleoenvironmental records from around us, especially from the north, because Billy Big Springs is definitely affiliated more with the north than it is, let's say, with Wyoming. I mean, I can guarantee you, those Wyoming fleet nappers were never at Billy Big Spring. and you will see why soon. So what we collected was, we looked at a ton of paleoenvironmental records, and a lot of those really good records, excellent records, come from actually Montana, the Marias Pass, and St. Mary, Garipi Lake and Lost Lake. Kathy Barnowski, Whitlock, actually did those records. And then St. Mary also has fantastic paleoenvironmental records. And so we know precisely when the area was deglaciated. We know exactly what happened during the Younger Dryas. We can pinpoint the onset and the first half of the Altithermal, and we can also tell, vegetational change, and during the forest succession, which has a 2,000-year lag. Forest succession began in the south, and it took 2,000 years to actually get any forest growing in southern and central Alberta. So we know how that succession happened, how the serritic landscapes developed in the early Holocene. So we had some really good data, and also from sites that were like-minded. They had similar records as we did. Okay, this graph is hard to read without actually reading the publication, but what the other thing that we did was we collected pollen records. We put together glued them together, all the pollen records that have really good dates and really good readings. And so you can tell there, I don't have a pointer, but you can tell how forest succession happened, how it lagged from south to north, how Artemisia changed into the quinoam serictic landscape during the Altithermal. And I know I should say the Holocene thermal maximum, but I get tongue-tied, so I'll just affectionately call it the Altithermal. So anyways, we put a lot of work into locating Billy Big Spring in the broad region that we had access to. So we've been working at it 5 years. We're still publishing stuff. We're still doing things. So, but you can see, what we did. We not only focused on Billy, but there's a lot of kettle lakes and spring-fed lakes around Two Medicine. So we did a survey. We surveyed 30 kettle lakes. 2 of them have artifacts in them, but the sites are buried. If I have enough life, I will probably go back to one of them and start excavating it. But yeah, we actually put a lot of effort in just expanding what we knew about Billy Big Springs. Excavations, aerial excavations, of course. Lots of shoulder-to-shoulder survey, because Billy has an interesting characteristic. The pond has been repeatedly trampled by wildlife and cattle. So artifacts, it has a really interesting taphonomic history. Artifacts actually move from the bottom to the surface of the pond. And that process keeps going on and on and on. So we say that we survey and map, total station map artifacts annually, but in truth, as soon as people finish eating their lunch every day, you know what they do? They just run into the pond to find more artifacts because they keep coming. It's really interesting. And so we did that, and then we did some other specialized analysis. Oh, and you know what? I am a radiocarbon dating fanatic. I always will like to have 10 more dates that I actually need. So we have a really hefty and really well dated stratigraphy there. This is us surveying shoulder to shoulder. You can see the density, the artifact density in the ponds. It is logical. Hunters were probably waiting for game to come to drink at the pond, and that is where they lost their points, and they lost a variety of other artifacts, or they tossed them in when they were no longer useful. And so the density, the artifact density at the pond is much larger than the rest of the landform. At some point, those are our aerial excavations. When we were just beginning, and Francois was taking, total station readings for the contour map, I had the luxury of sitting on the hill that overlooks the site from the south. So to the right of that graph, there was a big outcrop, as I said. And then I looked and looked and looked, and I kind of put my warp on it. And I thought, let's think like a hunter. Where would you put your camp? And it was obvious. I was sitting on the south and southeast. The obvious logical place was to actually put the excavation units on the west side, because hunters like to camp so that they can receive the rising sun. So Francois asked me, and I raised my Meriwether Lures finger, and I said, there. And I was right, and you'll see how. Logistics. Oh my God. Working at the Living Springs is something else. First of all, it is accessible by road, except that the road does not exist anymore. So we had to open our own road. And it goes up a really big hill and then comes down. The site is clay. So I demand 100% water screening. But we cannot water screen at the site. We have to transport all the dirt 25 miles downriver to the reclamation canal, where there is enough current that can actually wash away the sediment, which creates a huge problem when you're trying to actually backfill. We also have to ship everything that we own, including our clothes. We FedEx everything. I refuse to drive a truck with my stuff for 3 days, all the way to the site. I get there by plane with my carry-on, and I rent trucks. And please do not tell Enterprise what I do with those trucks. There is the travails of backfilling. One year we had the unfortunate idea of backfilling with hay bales. We came back the next year and they were completely rotten. And it was the most disgusting thing we have ever done, taking those out. So I said, no, we are bringing in sand. The problem was the sand truck could not get up that hill on our handmade road. So I had to use the Ram 1500, which by the way, I recommend to everyone, to actually bring 7 tons of sand into the site along with this tiny little cat. I believe that I went up and down the hill for about 25 times. But we did it. And of course, even though I discourage children from coming into the excavation simply because of liability, they somehow happen to appear every so often. And we have people of all ages working with us from the community, which is a lot of fun. All right, so let's do some cultural history. What did we find? I became, oh my goodness. Oh yeah, it's fine. I became a garden variety cultural historian sometime after I started working with bison hunting landscapes, because I had to do cultural history. Nobody had done cultural history in that place after Quijo, and I became a cultural historian because I wanted to implode the cultural history of the Blackfeet people. It had to be redone. We had to find new things and new ways of talking about them, about their ancestors. So what we found and what we really wanted to do in Billy was to understand the time. At the beginning, I thought, based on surface collections, that this was going to be a massive oxbow site. But no, it is not an oxbow site. I mean, it has an oxbow presence, but not nearly close to the caliber of Sally Thompson's Sun Riverside or Steve Abbott's, Creek Crossing, no. But as we went along, we were looking at the surface collections. We said, this site has to have a Paleo-Indian. I remember Steve Platt coming and visiting and said, you have to have Paleo-Indian in that site. You have to find a Paleo-Indian. It took us a couple of years, but we finally came to the Paleo-Indian, which is a mysterious Paleo-Indian, if you ask me. It is definitely embedded in glacial till. From this photo, you can see that the living floor had been cleared of glacial cobbles and stones. We found this mysterious looking artifact that she really wants to be a stem preform, but I am not sure that it is a stem preform, in a few artifacts, but enough for us to know that there was an early to middle Paleo-Indian presence. We know that the reservation has Cody complex. I mean, I found an agate basin site with amazing points plastered on the walls of an old reclamation canal. So I do know that we have early to middle Paleo-Indian at the site. In the reservation. It's just that where you find it, that is a big question. So we do have this occupation, and I call it a minimum age because we do have a problem with carbon enrichment. And that is a regional problem, it's not just us. We do have other rather strange looking possible early points. The bottom ones are early Paleo-Indian, and then some of late Paleo-Indian points. And the point experts here can argue with me all you want, but I suggest you call Francois, because he's the one who tagged the points. So we have a really nice, very nice, low density, but very nice, very well-defined late Paleo-Indian. And this late Paleo-Indian occupation actually corresponds to the onset of the altithermal. where we think that people were definitely coming into the site to hunt and take refuge from other more drier areas in the open plain. And then we have Mazama ashfall. So things were going very well for these people when disaster struck. There was the Mazama eruption, which has been compared to in intensity to Mount Tambora, which wiped out an island in 1816 and disrupted global climates for a couple of years. Mount Mazama was a really big eruption, one of the largest eruptions. And interestingly enough, it is considered one of the most important climatic events of the Holocene in the Northern Hemisphere. Interestingly enough, because of the westerly winds, of the prevailing winds, the ash didn't fall in Oregon. It fell in Montana, in Alberta, and in a little bit of Saskatchewan. So while the landscape recovered rather quickly in and around Crater Lake, which is the crater where Mount Mazama actually erupted, the people in Montana and around Billy Beaver Spring got just asphyxiated by the ash fall. Anywhere between a foot to 3 feet or more of ash fell, and it stayed in the landscape. Depending on what landform you look at, it stayed in the landscape. On the steep slopes of the fronts, the ash was washed out. And I remember Barney Reeves, questioning the fact that whether there was ashfall on the slopes of Glacier National Park and Waterton. But he found Mazama, but he didn't find him associated with archaeological sites. Well, we did. The ashfall was such that there was an exodus. People left. There's a big hiatus there. You can see our pollen records, what the ashfall did to the vegetation. I mean, it killed 80% of non-arboreal vegetation and probably young saplings. And it just suffocated the vegetation to the point where animals couldn't graze anymore. And without animals, people had to take an exodus. Where did they go? Hell, we don't know. There is a couple of oral traditions that I have found over the years. One that said that they went west and then they came back. One that says that they were north and then came back. Unfortunately, I don't see that anybody went to Wyoming, although they should have. The climate was better than that at the time. But there was an exodus to the east, and at the end of this talk, I'm going to tell you the significance of that. But they came back. Memory works. Memory. People came back to the site. The same early archaic hunters, well, the descendants, not the same hunters, their descendants came back, occupied not just the area, they occupied the same spots where their ancestors were actually sleeping and hunting. And that is an incredible thing. We have pre and post Mazama occupations. We call it loosely Mummy Cave Complex. Well, if you look at the photos, the projectile point photos in Trevor Peck's Archaeology of Alberta, which is our Bible, you will realize that Mummy Cave is a stretch. But it is Mummy Cave age, definitely. The 2 points to the right are ours, the other ones are pretty points that I found on the internet. So you can see the extent of the ashfall. So when they came back after the Mazama ashfall, they came back with a vengeance. With a vengeance, with new artifacts, all artifacts, new technologies. We do not have, unfortunately, any kind of non-lithic, non-flaked material. We do not have any groundstone, for example. These guys were hunters. They were not messing around with seeds. I can guarantee you that. These guys, this was a man cave, and they came to hunt. Interestingly enough, you see those teardrops. That is something that appears post-Mazama, and they are fairly common at the sites. If you want to look at them, at all the pictures, they are all published in our projectile point paper in Plains Anthropologist. I just put a few here just to illustrate. The picture to the right, those are artifacts embedded in ash. So as soon as these people could come back, they came while ash was still at the site. But obviously there were areas at the site where the ash had disappeared. We can only find it microscopically. And obviously the animals had returned. Then we have our coolest occupation, which is the Middle Archaic. It is a McKean occupation, and this is our floor. Of course, we think that there might have been a structure there, but as Marcel told us this morning, structures are in the eye of the beholder. Definitely a massive occupation. There's more debitage than soil, than sediment in that particular McKean occupation. There's a huge heart. And there were, we have like the non-projectile point collection. Unfortunately, I was not able to sort out through the hundreds of photos that we have of artifacts, but it has everything. It represents everything from varieties of colors all the way to the tiniest of tiny, like resharpening tools. Flakes. I've trained my water screeners to pick everything that they can see with the naked eye. So we have the entire sequence, the entire chain of repertoire of everything that these McKean people did at the site. Underneath this, there is, as I said before, an Augsburg presence. And it's about, I want to say, about 4,900 cal. But it is not a floor, it's not an occupation, it's just a presence that is somehow overwhelmed by the McKean occupation. Interestingly enough, there's McKean sites that are considered, that Barney Reeves in Waterton, in Glacier, in Waterton, that Barney Reeves considered to be bighorn sheep hunting sites. We have not found a single bone of bighorn sheep. These people came for bison. I think that we have one deer bone in our collection. They weren't messing around with little animals. They want to wrestle. And this was, prime bison land. Like in the middle of the fescue grassland, bison were everywhere. So this represents the intensity of occupation, and as you can see, the Middle Archaic, the Middle Archaic is the real McCoy at Billy Big Springs. We have everything represented, except Clovis, but we have stem points. But that is, you can see how it is, how intense the occupation was, and that is 1.5 meters. Profile, excavated by 5 centimeters, and that's what we have. I believe that does not represent the whole site. I asked Francois, he said that it only represents the western blocks, not the southern blocks, so we have more artifacts to add to that. And interestingly, people were not really interested in the foothill, in the front or the uplands during the late pre-contact period. The explanation is very easy. All they were doing was pushing bison off the cliff, downriver. They weren't interested in the mountains except maybe to collect some things in the fall. They were all living downriver in the central portion of the Two Medicine Valley and other adjacent, west-east drainages like Cut Bank, and the Milk River, and so forth. So they kind of used the mountains at the time, the front, but no, terrible. People used to hunt there when people could hunt anywhere in the reservation before state permitting actually happened. People hunted there all the time. They still collect wood there for a variety of things and berries. So we looked at the raw materials, and for our projectile point paper, because we have lots of points. For such a small site, we have a lot of points. And so Francois spent, I don't know how many months or how many work hours looking at typing the raw materials that are represented in our projectile point collection. And it is incredible how many raw materials are represented. And it is easy to understand. Points are highly curated items. You can go anywhere and you can grab the raw material you like and make a point and bring it back. And so this is just a sample of the raw materials represented in our projectile points. There's all kinds, anywhere from local to Nieves River, from Swan River to Nieves River Flint, to Tongue River orthocort to Bowman Church from the Continental Divide, and day sites from the Lewis and Clark National Forest way to the south. Everything is represented in there. And it is really interesting because the local industry is mostly made of the two medicine silicified mudstone, which is local, is part of the glacial till from the two medicine low till that came from the Pinedale glaciation. And I know that Francois hates when I say this, but I'm pretty sure that these guys selected their raw materials to make non-projectile point artifacts because they were black. The vast majority of non-projectile point raw materials are black or light or dark gray. He doesn't believe me, but I know that people prefer color, and they have color preferences that are part of who they are. So there's a lot of geographic affinities. When you look at Billy Big Spring from the projectile point eye, you can look at lots of geographic affinities far and wide, both in terms of raw materials and in terms of types, although our types are rather strange, as I mentioned. So what we found was that there is an affinity. Of course, the front is the major source of everything, but early on, Paleoindian, Late Archaic, there is an affinity for Western style projectile points and Western materials. And that changes after the Mazama eruption, the Middle Archaic, the Middle Holocene, well, the Late Middle Holocene and early Late Holocene, Middle Archaic. The shift is to the east. And then you get to the late pre-contact and you cannot tell, because you can go into the Rocky Mountain Trench and the points are identical to the points we have. So you can see how the front and the Continental Divide, those were porous boundaries. People cross those boundaries all the time. The Tumedicine River, it's a tributary of the Marias River, which in turn runs into the Missouri and cuts across a very easily traversable terrain. The site was accessible to people from all directions. So it is totally understandable that people, hunted and traveled far and wide and brought their materials to hunt bison at the site, because that is a hunting camp. That is a hunting site. It's nothing but a hunting site. And if you look at the paper, you can study this in detail. I don't want to spend extra time explaining this, but there are certain complexes like Maple Leaf, for example, which is really important along the front, which is really just it is ours. We share it with and it's an early archaic. We share it with Southern Alberta, but with nobody else. There's others that we share, with everyone, all the way to Mammy Cave. So, what did we learn from Billy? At the local level, the very first and most important thing that we learned was that kettles, glacial kettles, are a landform that has a lot of potential for early buried sites. And it probably has more potential than anywhere else. When McGregor and colleagues did their coring on Swift Current Lake in Glacier National Park, what they found was tremendous amounts of landscape instability during the Younger Dryas and right after the Younger Dryas. And, you know, isostatic movements and you know, erosion, landslides, tremendous instability. And as a result of that, both in southern Alberta and in northern Montana, what you have are sites that are either completely deflated, and the vast majority of early sites are on the surface, or they are buried under so much sediment that it is a miracle if you find them. Maybe if you cut a road through them, you will find them, but otherwise, you know, it'll take you a lifetime to dig those sites and perhaps not even find anything there. So glacial kettles are buried, some of the sites are buried, but they are not very, very deeply. There is no water, there is no current. So water is not going to wash away your artifacts. Artifacts actually sink. They do not run with the water, as was the case of my unfortunate Agate Basin site on the Milk River. So they are really, really good, you know, and kettles evolved through time, and because due to climate and runoff, and in the case of our kettle, an outlet was formed. It broke a dike, so it was starting to lose water. So unfortunately, you know, snow and snow melt and runoff, seasonal runoff keeps the kettle viable for animals, even though obviously the outlet started eating into the aquifer. We also learned that it was a refuge during the Altithermal. And that is probably, you know, the most important thing about looking at upland sites. Look at them as refuge due to the fact that they have perch aquifers. And even during times of droughts and heat and, increased temperature, those aquifers are still going to be viable. We have a tremendous vegetational history beginning before deglaciation, but most accurately since deglaciation. And those records are incredible. Like, for example, we didn't know, everybody thinks that the people, the Blackfoot people, like a lot of researchers have said that the Blackfoot people roasted camas, collected roasted camas. That's not true. There was no camas in that area until the late pre-contact period. Nobody roasted camas there. They got it through exchange with the kidney. They only boiled tubers and only ceremonially. So we know that camas weren't there, so that was not part of the culture until the late pre-contact and historic periods. Those are things that are important to know, so that it kind of completes the picture, the cultural picture. Then we have a really nice and complete local industry. Our cores are very cool. They are cobbles, about the size of an egg. Back in the day, you could buy a dozen for 10 cents. Now they're $12.99 a dozen. We have thumb scrapers that are the size an inch long, made of tiny little pebbles. We actually have one conical core, beautiful core. And I wish I had the picture available to me right now. So in regional terms, we have an example of regional place persistence. I mean, people came back to the sites where they were successful at hunting. Places where they develop cultural attachments, logistical attachments, maybe spiritual attachments. And those are, like reserved in memory. People remember over generations. So sometimes over millennia, they keep those memories. So people come back. And then we, of course, have our records, as I said before, compatible. And the fact that our projectile points really point to widespread information in social networks that ebbed and flowed through time. Sometimes they were affinity with the West, sometimes with the East, Sometimes, you cannot tell because everybody was going everywhere during the late pre-contact period. There were tremendous, like this morning we heard about tremendous trade networks that cut across the plains and the Rockies and all the way into the Columbia Valley. So, we have that. We have that. And now for the surprise. So, the Blackfoot Early Origins program contains ancient DNA. That was my purpose. When I was working with the Blood tribe of Alberta, I was doing research for their Aboriginal rights litigation, land claims. And I was thinking, one day I was giving a presentation, an update to the council, and I said, would you consider doing DNA? It would help your Aboriginal rights litigation, perhaps. And they thought about it, and at the end of my presentation, they said, well, how much would it cost us? And I said, nothing. Because if you say yes, I'm gonna write a proposal, and we're gonna get the money for it. And we did. Now, doing the study was easier said than done. Because first of all, we could not get permission to sample pre-contact remains because institutions like the Royal Museum in Alberta wanted us to consult with 20 tribes from different ethnicities to actually let us sample for something for the Blackfoot. That would have never happened. So I abandoned that really quickly, and instead we focused on the living, which, by the way, with the elders we had to do, genealogies, to make sure that they were, Blackfoot for at least several generations, and they didn't have European admixture. And we also located historical remains that were labeled Blood/Blackfoot, and also that had come from the Blackfoot Reservation. So we sampled that. So it was a small sample. I sampled that. And in the graph, one of the things that I wanted to point out, the red square, when my geneticist, my colleague Ripan Malhi from Illinois, Urbana, and his colleagues started looking at the DNA samples, the preliminary, it was really obvious that all of the Blackfoot samples stayed together, that they did not mix with anyone else. But we didn't know whether that was a factor of statistical error or something. So we picked out two samples that we had a full nuclear sequence of that. I gotta say we only did two because every nuclear sequence cost $5,000. So they did all kinds of things. And they said, this lineage in the clad actually sticks out on its own. And I said, Ripan, we gotta date it. We gotta find a date. So a year passed of multiple mysterious to me statistical analysis until we got a date for the origin of the Blackfoot, of genetically Blackfoot lineage in the clad. And as it turns out, it's about 18,000 years old. We can genetically identify Blackfoot people, Blackfoot humans, as early as the Late Pleistocene. Where did they live? Who knows? 3 lifetimes I can live without probably ever finding an 18,000-year-old site with genetically Blackfoot people in there. You know that. It is nearly impossible to find sites that age because they are destroyed. I mean, they were washed away. They do not exist. And the few and rare that exist are so controversial that you cannot really even count on them. And this is something hard for me to explain to the Blackfoot. Now, they can say that now they know that they have been in the homeland for 18,000 years, but I cannot show them the sites where their ancestors lived because there are none. And I really make an effort to say that the fact that this is a genetically Blackfoot clad doesn't mean that these people were actually culturally Blackfoot, because we know that the Blackfoot ethnogenesis happened in the Middle Archaic, in the early Middle Archaic, when we can actually identify, yeah, this is Blackfoot. But not before, not 18,000 years ago. But tantalizing nonetheless, and it was so important for them to actually get to say, our ancestors are 80,000 years old. Remember, when I came to the reservation in 2004, we only have 3 radiocarbon dates, and they were all late. And now we can say that we have genetically Blackfoot people that split from the clade before the Anzic burial, the Anzic baby did, and all of his descendants, before the Athabascans split. That is how old they are. And to finish this, let's talk about language. This is my last slide. Language is really interesting and also controversial among the Blackfoot. In the 1960s or 50s, John Siebert, an Algonquian linguist, very famous, he decided that all the Algonquian languages derived from a center around the Great Lakes. And of course, Blackfoot was considered an Algonquian language. And so it must have derived from the Great Lakes and arrived into what it was sometime in the late prehistory, middle prehistory, late prehistory. But then Professor Goddard from the Smithsonian went and looked at it and said, no, this isn't happening. When you look at Blackfoot, first of all, there is a west to east incline in terms of how the language evolved. And then he looked some more, and in the company of a young man, Byrne, I can't remember his last name, and they found that 23% of the modern Blackfoot language is actually not Algonquian. It is a far older version of a language that is an algic language like Algonquian, but is not Algonquian. I suspect, and this is my wild, uneducated guess, because I'm not a linguist, that Algonquian came into being and became integrated into the old people's language. Probably sometime during the Exodus after the Mazama ashfall. That is my uneducated guess. Don't cite me on that. Although I believe that in our science paper, we actually said that. So yeah, you can cite me on that. Anyways, I felt that I needed to tell you this. Of course, you cannot historically date language beyond 6,000 or 7,000 years. But that is enough for us because we know what happened at the time. And we know that perhaps in rituals, like Riley was talking this morning, there are rituals where there have to be so exacting songs, prayers, words, and so forth, that the old Blackfoot language, the language of the first ancestors, is probably preserved in them. I'm going to leave you with that. Thank you.